This is an interview with General David Petraeus. General Petraeus spent 37 years in the US Army, leading the US Central Command or the coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. And after his military service ended, he became the director of the CIA. Overall, he's considered one of the most prominent and effective military leaders of this century. In this conversation, we talk about his experience from Iraq and Afghanistan, but mostly about the war in Ukraine. What lessons should we be taking away from it? Whether we have a strategy to win the war, or what is going to happen next? If you enjoy this podcast, consider becoming a supporter. You help me make this happen, and in return, you get full ad-free episodes, bonus content, and the ability to ask my guests your questions. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be with you, Dominic. Thanks.
So I want to talk about Russia and Ukraine mostly, but before we jump into that, I wanted to help people understand your career a little bit better, which is obviously incredible. And I think many people are aware of the positions that you held and how important these positions are, but it's maybe hard to imagine what that work actually looks like, since it's very distant from the everyday reality of most people. So to start, and I know this is difficult, but I wanted to ask if you could try to describe what your day in the life looked like if you look back at the time when you were a four-star general in the US Army and then a director at the CIA afterwards.
Well, it would be an understatement to say that all of those positions, because of course the four-star positions, each of those was in combat, command of the war in Iraq, then the Greater Middle East, U.S. Central Command, then Afghanistan, and then of course the CIA. And the demands were obviously very considerable. In truth, though, I think what you were always conscious of in a position like that, at least I was the enormous privilege that you had to be leading a mission that's larger than self. In some cases, was perhaps the most important overseas military effort the U.S. was pursuing. The responsibilities for America's sons and daughters, those of coalition countries and our partners and so forth. So again, the magnitude of the mission, the problem, the challenge was very, very evident and obvious. The pressure is enormous. The experience on many days, particularly again in Iraq, where the violence levels were just so high and the casualties were so substantial, and the loss of life, civilian life, due to suicide bombings. I remember one day there were over 150 civilians killed in 3 separate suicide vest attacks in Baghdad markets alone. And that experience can only be described as grinding. You're right at the edge of your physical capability in terms of the extent of the day. I mean, we determined that I had to have at least 6 hours of sleep a night, at least. And if you get a little bit more than that, but anything less than that over a sustained period, keep in mind, you don't get to sleep in on the weekends. It's a 7-day-a-week endeavor. You don't get a break. I would go back to the United States periodically, but it was always to testify before Congress. It wasn't for vacation. So the nature of the experience, again, can only be described, particularly in the tough times. And the bulk of the surge in Iraq was tough, although toward the final 6 months or so, it was so obvious that it was succeeding. Eventually we drove violence down by nearly 90% in the 18 months that we had additional forces. That was a 19.5-month tour for me. But again, the only way to describe that is to say that it was a really grinding experience. And you're just pushing yourself as hard as you can. All the folks around you are pushing as hard as they can. The troops in the field, for whom you feel this incredible responsibility, are pushing as hard as they can. The weather is extreme. It'd be 120 degrees in Baghdad with a 15 to 25 knot wind blowing sand in your face. Winters were excruciating in Kabul. All of this, again, it's tough. It's hard. But as I said in the speech when I took command in Baghdad, took command of the surge, in Iraq, it's all hard all the time, but hard is not hopeless. And our great young men and women in uniform and their coalition and Iraqi and Afghan and other partners, together with our diplomatic intelligence, development, rule of law, and other partners, proved that that was true. And in the course of the surge in Iraq, driving violence down by nearly 90%, even the fiercest critics of the surge acknowledged that it had worked, and it continued to work for another 3.5 years as we had an orderly drawdown of our forces and a transition of responsibilities to the Iraqis. In fact, violence continued to go down a bit more during that period. Afghanistan was different, but it was a different theater. And I had pointed out to Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld years earlier as a 3-star when he asked me to do an assessment of the situation in Afghanistan on the way home from my 3-star tour in Iraq. Keep in mind, I was a 2-star, 3-star, 4-star in Iraq, then 4-star for the whole region, then 4-star in Afghanistan. But I did an assessment on my way home in 2005. And I came back and I said that Afghanistan was going to be the longest of the long wars, because all the factors there were just so much more challenging, frankly. Most significantly, of course, the sanctuaries that the Afghan Taliban and their partners in the insurgency, the Haqqani network, had in neighboring Pakistan, something that was maddening, infuriating, really, because they refused to do anything about it and wouldn't let us do much about it either. Nothing, in fact, to the Afghan Taliban who were in Baluchistan. So again, it's just very, very tough, but you're conscious of the extraordinary responsibility and the importance of the mission that has been entrusted to you. I mean, there is one person at the top of these kinds of endeavors, and to do that even once is the greatest of privileges. To do it twice, to command 2 wars at their height, really was quite extraordinary, and I'll always be grateful for that. Although I'd certainly wish that we hadn't had to have that at all. If things could have gone perfectly along the way, I'd have been happy to continue it just sort of good old peacetime soldiering.
I would love to talk about your experiences from Iraq and Afghanistan. I could probably talk about it for hours, but I want to take the advantage of having someone like you with the unique experience with war and conflict. And I want to talk about the crucial conflict of today that's happening in Ukraine. And given what's happening at the moment, I have to start there because you're someone who, as a military commander, planned and led a number of major operations and theaters. So, as someone with that kind of experience, what are your thoughts on the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk?
Very impressive. They have achieved not just tactical surprise, but really it appears to be operational and strategic surprise. The Russians were taken completely unawares of what was going on, to bring together elements of 4 different Ukrainian brigades. This is not just the Russians who were fighting for the Ukrainians, the Legion, which is what would conduct raids essentially into Belgorod Oblast or province in the past. This is Ukrainian forces, among the best that they have, pulled together, and not just infantry and armor, tanks. It's also air defense artillery to protect them from the Russian drones and aircraft. It is electronic warfare part to do the same. It is artillery. It's their own drones and aircraft that they can bring as close as they can to that. They're not doing true close air support the way we would describe it, because the air defense challenges are so substantial. It's the logistics to fuel and arm and fix and water and everything else. So this is a very substantial task, to bring it all together, to prepare it, to plan it in meticulous detail, and then to execute it as impressively as they have is really quite something. I'll be in Kyiv in a few weeks, and I look forward to sitting down with General Syrskyi, the commander of the Ukrainian forces, who reportedly is the mastermind behind this, who planned it, oversaw its execution, which included extraordinary operational security. They apparently postured this as a training exercise and took the Russians completely unawares, rolled right through the border defenses, such as they were, and have expanded to well over 1,000 square kilometers under the control of the Ukrainians. And the Russian response has been incoherent, ineffective, slow, and totally unimpressive. Even just the idea that you would put the Minister of Emergency Affairs in charge of this instead of the military is seemingly incoherent to me. I don't know why Putin would have done that. Perhaps it's because the National Guard and the police and these others might respond to them, but this is something that's going to require real serious military capability. And that has not yet been mustered. Russia doesn't want to withdraw forces from the southeast of Ukraine, where very concerningly, frankly, they continue to achieve incremental gains, particularly in Donetsk province. And the Ukrainians are going to have to figure out how it is they can shore up those defenses while still trying to hang on to what it is they have in Kursk and perhaps even expand it a bit into Belgorod and some other areas. So again, a very impressive operation, very tangible achievements on the ground. They have cut the most important rail line between Moscow and southeast Ukraine. That's very significant because, as you know, I'm sure the Russians depend on the rail system for movement of vehicles, weapon systems, logistics, ammunition, and so forth. That's their lifeline, and that has been interdicted. So it requires them to go a much longer distance to circumvent that. And they seemingly have no reserves that are available. The report of late is that they're going to move forces from eastern Russia, which is quite a long way. Again, they'll have to do it by rail. And whether those forces are ready, whether they are well trained, well equipped, well structured, well commanded, I think is very much in question, because that certainly has not been the characteristic of the forces that Russia has mustered to counter this offensive so far. So a very important achievement, again, tangible results on the ground, physically cutting the rail line, occupying this territory, getting them closer to Russian airfields that they've been able to attack with drones and so forth with considerable effect as well. But also a huge shot in the arm, if you will, a psychological lift for a population that really has watched their forces be on the defense and gradually, incrementally giving up amounts of ground, albeit with huge Russian losses, just staggering. They're incomprehensible to me as someone who wrote letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers every night, just about, that I was privileged to command in combat. But this, after the summer offensive of last year, which did not achieve what we all hoped it would in the face of the very, very substantial Russian defenses in the south, the Surovikin line, named for the general who oversaw the establishment of these layers of defense with miles deep minefields, trenches, overhead cover, barbed wire, concertina, and on top of that, drones that will identify Ukrainians as they're trying to pick their way through the minefields and the obstacles, and digitally send grids back to the fire direction center, put those on the guns, and have accurate fire very quickly. In fact, this is a battlefield overall that I think was beautifully captured by the great Washington Post journalist Max Boot, who described this as the war in which all quiet on the Western Front, of course, a reference to World War I, meets Blade Runner, a reference to the future. And in this case, we're seeing both the past in warfare, trenches, Cold War era tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and artillery, and then some very cutting edge systems when it comes to drones. And of course, the Ukrainians, particularly impressive when it comes to technology. They are producing, their goal is to produce 1 million drones in 12 months. And I think they may actually do that or come very close to that. And if you do the math, that means that they're able to throw thousands of low cost, one way suicide, first person view drones at the Russians every single day. And that is what is enabling them to hold the Russians off, or at least limit their gains to quite incremental ones, even though they're in many cases outnumbered probably 3, 4, 5 to 1. It's also what enabled a country that has no navy to sink 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet and drive them out of the centuries-old port of Sevastopol in Western Crimea and out of the Western Black Sea entirely, using aerial drones to find the Russian ships, and then maritime drones to sink them, produced by Ukraine. So the distinguishing feature on the Ukrainian side really is their very, very impressive manufacturing, design, IT skills, and so forth. Noting that the Russians have some pretty considerable skills as well in this regard, some that they're buying from Iran in the forms of the Shahed drones, missiles, and so forth, but also electronic warfare, which has made some of our most accurate systems and munitions, the Excalibur artillery round, for example, that would land in a small table, is no longer as accurate as it was. The same with some of our other GPS guided precision munitions. The Ukrainians are iterating, they're constantly changing their software and demonstrating the enormous engineering skills. By the way, an anticipation of the future, when the guns do fall silent in Ukraine, I think Ukraine will emerge as a military production powerhouse that shows agility far more than our own system. It's only now that you see startups in the United States that are focused on doing what startups in Ukraine have been doing for a year and a half or 2 years, which is very rapidly producing very low cost, but actually very effective uh, unmanned systems, mostly in the air so far, but also, as I mentioned, at sea. And now they're about to unleash the hounds of hell, the robotic dogs, which are going to add another dimension to this battle.
Just a quick break here. In the coming months, I will be starting a newsletter focused on what you need to know and what you might have missed in geopolitics. It's completely free and you can already sign up for it, and it would be quite helpful if you do that. You can find the link for the sign up in the description below. And now, back to the conversation. I couldn't agree more. I expect Ukraine to emerge out of the war as a major military industrial powerhouse. But if we go back to the beginning, away from what's happening now, how did you personally expect the Russian invasion to unfold before it happened, as someone with your caliber of experience, compared to how it then really took place? And did you expect the Russian military to do as badly as it ended up doing?
Well, I was one who said that I didn't think the Russians would take Kyiv. And in part because I'd been in Ukraine on a number of occasions. I've been to the front lines. I watched literally over the years from 2014 in particular, of course, the occupation of Crimea and then the Donbass, as the Ukrainians became more and more and more professional, better arms and better training and so forth. And I know the sprawl around Kyiv as well. It's a defender's dream, frankly. You can force the enemy onto roads, you can stop them, you can drop bridges, and they did all of that. But it was a closer run affair, I think, that people realized, because had they been able to get the airfield right outside Kyiv, the military airfield, they might have been able to pour troops in, they might have been able to get into Kyiv, and they might have been able to cause a lot more problems. I didn't anticipate that the Russians would be as inept as they were. What was stunning to me was the lack of proficiency in the most basic of tasks by the Russians, despite the fact that they had had months in which they presumably would have been training. They were deployed in east of Ukraine and then also to the north in Belarus. You give me if I was the commander of these troops and you gave me months to train them, I would like to think that I could have had them far better, far more proficient than what we actually saw on the battlefield, where they bunched up. One round will get you. They got stuck on roads. They had no discipline. The radios didn't work. I thought that they had more modern equipment as well. They always advertise this, but if you compare, for example, their radio system, that's the backbone of their tactical command and control. Ours is FM, so you don't want to broadcast to the whole world, just broadcast as far as you need to go, line of sight generally. It's frequency hopping, so it's very hard to lock on and stay with it. And even if you can, it's encrypted, so you can't hear what it says anyway. The Russians, on the other hand, had HF, which broadcasts very widely. Anyone with a police scanner can pick it up. Single channel, so once you find it, you lock onto it. And unencrypted in the clear, so you can actually hear what they're saying. And in fact, the Ukrainian civilians with police scanners would record this stuff when the Russians were criticizing their bosses or complaining, and upload it on social media. Of course, one of the distinguishing features of this war is that for the first time ever, everyone has a smartphone, internet access, and social media platforms into which they can upload videos and photographs and so forth. So the transparency here, the open source component of intelligence, is enormous. And then they jam these channels, so the Russian leaders would have to go up to the front, they'd have to get out of their vehicle, find out what's the nature of the delay, and then they're getting killed by snipers trained by Americans and other Western forces prior to the latest invasion. Then they would use their cell phones. Then the Ukrainians would shut down access for the Russian prefix cell phones. Then they'd steal Ukrainian cell phones, and the Ukrainians would do Find My iPhone and put accurate fire on that location. So again, the ineptitude here, the poor campaign design, the lack of a real main effort, the weighting of that main effort, the lack of, again, almost every, from basic soldier tasks on up, was really quite stunning. Again, I never thought that they were 10 feet tall. We saw that, frankly, as we realized what we'd been facing during the Cold War years later. But I thought that they would have had enough mass. I thought they would have had enough training while they were out there. Thought they would have had better equipment and so forth. And it turned out they just weren't that good. And on the other hand, the Ukrainians turned out to demonstrate enormous initiative, innovativeness, courage, determination. And they were led by someone who just was a near pitch perfect strategic leader, who's, the task of a strategic leader to get the big ideas right, craft the right strategy, communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization, the country, everyone who has a stake in the outcome of that endeavor, oversee their implementation, and determine how you need to refine the big ideas as the situation evolves to do it again and again and again. What was President Zelensky's first big idea? I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. I'm staying in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. We're going to defend Kyiv to the death. This is our war of independence. All men are going to stay in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. And then his communication skills, of course, were fantastic. He was, after all, an actor, a comedian who played the president so effectively that he got elected president. And then his example, his energy, his inspiration, nightly talks to the Ukrainian people, his presence on the battlefield, even putting on a uniform on day one and never putting a suit back on to this day, attracting the right people, getting rid of the wrong people. He's fired a lot of people for corruption, ineptitude, and all the rest of that. And then, of course, always iterating, if you will, determining how you need to change the big ideas and do it again and again. Not flawless. There's some drama underneath the surface in politics in Ukraine, as there always is. But by contrast with Putin, who vastly overestimated his own forces' capabilities, completely underestimated the Ukrainians, and very likely the American-led Western response to this, which I think he looked at Afghanistan and said they're never going to respond particularly impressively, and yet we did. Certainly, we delayed some decisions far too long, but the overall reaction has been very, very substantial. In this latest U.S., although it took too long to get there, but $61 billion is a very considerable amount of security assistance. So in all of this, what you see is a compare and contrast of strategic leaders, and Zelensky appearing to be very impressive in that regard. It is impressive, and Putin not. But at the end of the day, there is a context in which conflict takes place. And in this case, the context is one in which the Russians have an economy that's 10 times the size of the Ukrainians. And because people are still willing to buy their oil and gas and minerals and so forth, they can still survive and keep the military industrial complex going after a fashion at the least. And then they have probably a 4 or 5 to 1 manpower advantage. And they're just buying rural conscripts, soldiers, volunteers, by huge enlistment bonuses, more than a year's salary, and then enormous death gratuities. And they're throwing soldiers at the Ukrainian lines, human wave attacks taking colossal casualties, but seemingly unconcerned. and not yet at a point where Russia's mothers and fathers and wives say, not our son, not our husband, uh, although hopefully that moment may arrive at some point in time, hastened perhaps by the latest Russian ineptitude, which is, of course, the response to the Kursk counteroffensive by the Ukrainians.
You write about this in your book about the need for leaders to get the big ideas right and craft the right strategic approach. And if you look at the wider West and our approach to this war, do you think that we do have a strategy and do we have the right one? And what do you think that this strategic approach to this war of the US and the West in general should be?
Well, I think that the US led Western response, which includes very, very robust European assistance. Keep in mind that in aggregate, if you roll up all the European countries and the EU as a body, uh, they've contributed more altogether in not just security, but also in humanitarian and economic assistance. I think they actually may have been slightly greater in security, although we probably are catching up again now on the US side. But if you look at the overall Western support for Ukraine, it is very, very considerable. I'm not sure that many would have predicted that level of assistance. But that said, I think one can ask whether there truly is a strategy if you don't have a stated desired end state. And it's never been entirely clear whether we want the Ukrainians just not to lose or want them to win. We have had a lot of self-deterrence, over caution, I think, over the years. So all of this, I think, does allow one to ask whether we have, again, established what it is we really want to achieve, and then have gone about trying to provide the Ukrainians the wherewithal to help them achieve that. Again, it's a bit more of the develop the situation, ensure that they can't lose, ensure, what the statement is, as much as they need for as long as they need. Well, not quite. So I think there is that, keeping in mind that, of course, this is a coalition effort, and there's always a concern that you could lose some element in that coalition, particularly when it comes to NATO, who could block NATO support in various ways. And you have a country like Hungary that had been persuaded by Italy not to veto something important. So there's always that. There's a tiny bit of a least common denominator issue here when you're talking about a coalition. Although, again, while I'm very proud of what America has done and the way it responded very impressively, particularly in the early months, and then over the course of years with this very considerable amount of assistance, we have delayed decisions in ways that I think was uncalled for. We waited far too long in the M1 tank decision, which delayed the German decision on Leopards. F-16s were inevitable. There's just no other alternative. We had to do that, and we should have done it sooner. The longer range Army tactical missile system should have been sooner. Some of the other weapon systems and capabilities, and then the restrictions on them. Reportedly, the ATACMS can't be used in certain parts of Russia, same perhaps with some other munitions and so on. I think that has been far too cautious. We have self-deterred. I think at periods there were questions, will the Ukrainians fight in the beginning? Should we give them all these sophisticated weapons if they're just going to fall into the hands of the enemy, as was the case in Afghanistan, that kind of thing. So this is the reality, again, of the situation. Very impressive support, extraordinary Ukrainian determination, innovativeness, creativity, now even operational strategic campaign. But this is a tough situation, and there's no clear outcome that's coming into shape here right now. And I, for one, believe that we should do even more for Ukraine. We should enable them to liberate all the possible territory that they can, and they're doing a very impressive job in a lot of ways. I mean, they're making Crimea untenable as a naval base, an air base, a headquarters, even logistical lines. They're going to cut the ability of Russia to even put ferries across. I think at some point the Kerch Strait Bridge is going to be brought down. But again, let's give them all that they can possibly use and then enable them to achieve everything that they possibly can, change the dynamics of this war so that there can be some kind of meaningful negotiations and get the guns to go silent, provide adequate, rock solid security guarantees for Ukraine, get them into the EU, and then allow Ukraine to flourish as continued independent democracy that embraces free market capitalism. So, and I, for one, don't believe that we can't do all of this and Indo-Pacific and help in the Middle East. I believe we have to. I think it's in our cold, hard national security interest to do this. And if you don't support Ukraine, why would they believe that you would support Taiwan or support, again, Israel or the Gulf states or some other situation? So that would be how I would come at this. And again, I'm a huge champion of Ukraine, so huge that Putin has sanctioned me a couple of years ago. I should note, having beat me out for Time Person of the Year in 2007 as well, something I still take personally. But Dominic, I think we're going to have to start to draw this to a close. And so if you have one last question, I'll be happy to take it.
Sure. One last question. If you look at the war in Ukraine and how incredibly transformative it has been for our thinking about defense and military and security, we tend to look at the lessons that we take away from it on sort of a granular tactical level. But if you look at the conflict, what are some strategic lessons that the United States and the West and their armed forces should be taking away from this war and our approach to it so that
Sure.
in future
Yeah.
we can be more successful?
Well, first is a point that we make in the book that you referred to earlier, and that is that what you do in one part of the world influences perceptions in others. And that's crucial because what we're trying to do in the most important theater in the world, which is the one that encompasses the US and Western relationship with China, is to deter conflict. And deterrence rests on two elements. The first is the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities, more than just military, but at the end of the day, that's really the foundational piece. And the second is the potential adversary's assessment of your willingness to use those capabilities. And if you have a red line in Syria that turns out not to be a red line, that undermines deterrence. If you withdraw from Afghanistan when you haven't lost a soldier in 18 months, you only had 3,500 on the ground, and the cost was relatively modest, and your coalition allies wanted to stay, and your partners on the ground wanted you to stay, that sends a message. I remember being in the office of the Prime Minister of Singapore one time, and he turned to me and said, at the red line time, he said, that reverberates out here. That has implications for deterrence in the South China Sea. So if you, again, don't support Ukraine, why would they believe that you would support, again, Taiwan or one of the allies out in the First Island chain? So that's, I think, a very significant strategic reality, in my view, albeit one that not everyone embraces. Beyond that, I think that we need to recognize that we have to transform our force structure much more rapidly than we are, from what simplistically might be described as a small number of large platforms to a massive number of small platforms. The large platforms, of course, are heavily manned, exorbitantly expensive, incredibly capable, but also increasingly vulnerable. And the small platforms are unmanned, not just remotely piloted, but increasingly algorithmically piloted, much cheaper, still quite capable, and if deployed in sufficient numbers, can have a significant, a decisive impact. You've heard the Indo-Pacific commander told the Washington Post reporter that he intends to turn the Taiwan Strait into a hellscape. Well, how do you do that? Well, unmanned systems below the surface of the water, on the surface, in the air, on ground, in space, and cyberspace everywhere. But that requires a very, very different operational concept. It always begins with doctrine, with concepts. It involves different force structure organizationally and in terms of materiel. It requires different leader development, training of forces, facilities, personnel policies. I mean, you have to have very substantial change, institutional change. And I don't see us doing this as rapidly as I believe we should be, in large measure because what Senator McCain used to describe as the military-industrial congressional complex, each element of that has vested interests in legacy systems, legacy basing, legacy concepts, et cetera. And there has to be radical transformation, beginning with operational concepts and then working through these other areas in accordance with the changes in the concepts. So that's what we see out there right now. That's what we should be doing. These are the implications of what we're seeing in Ukraine. I think you do still need to have flexibility of mind every time we declare the end of the tank on the battlefield. You have a counteroffensive like the one in Kursk, where you realize that tanks are pretty valuable. We didn't use tanks much in Iraq until the Battle of Sadr City. We rolled the M1 tanks and the Bradley fighting vehicles in a counterinsurgency. So there's always going to be a back and forth. There will be technology advances on each side. It will go, again, back and forth between offense and defense. We thought defense had the advantage in Ukraine. It still does in parts of Ukraine, but we've seen not in all parts. So, and that probably underscores the continued importance, the critical nature, again, of leadership, particularly that at the very top, but also at other levels as well. And a culture of learning, of initiative, of figuring out, as I used to advocate in Iraq, in the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. But with that, with thanks for, again, the opportunity to be with you, I'll have to bring this to a close. And again, with appreciation for being with you on this podcast.